Er zijn altijd mensen die het anders doen dan alle anderen. En een van die mensen is Marc Bernstein. Hij was ooit het hoofd van alle internetsites van CNN en alle andere mediabedrijven van Turner Communications, voordat het verkocht werd aan Time Warner. Hij kwam met CNN.com, met de mobiele website van CNN. En toen hij wegging, ging hij naar een internetbedrijf wat heel snel daarna naar de beurs ging. Nou, dat soort mensen worden altijd daarna een beetje vreemd, want dan verdienen ze veel geld. En wat begon hij toen? Een boekenuitgeverij. Hij heeft allemaal gedacht over hoe je wel geld kan verdienen met internet en nieuws en media. En we gaan met hem praten bij hem thuis op zijn balkon. Hij schijnt een leuk uitzicht te hebben.
Don't stop believing. Hold on to that feeling. Street light people. Don't stop.
So you were senior vice president and general manager of CNN.com. So basically you ran the website.
And other digital media properties.
Like which ones?
CNN Mobile came out of our group, CNN on pagers, and a variety of other languages. I think a lot of things have changed since those days. And when we launched CNN and we played with the ideas and generally started to use streaming audio,
Yeah.
and then gradually we moved to streaming video. And now if you go to CNN.com, they're dominating that site with video. And the quality of the video is almost television quality. So I think that's changed a lot. Clearly the independent journalists, the bloggers, have changed the way we consume news. But I think ultimately the influencers, the people that we rely upon for the end result of news is the general mainstream press like CNN and New York Times.
Rupert Murdoch recently announced that he wants to close off access to all his websites and have people pay for the content. Do you think he's crazy or does he have a point?
I think he has a point, and my guess is that it's a little bit of bluster. What was announced this week about the New York Times metering their site, trying to give some people free content and other people to pay for it, I think is ultimately a model that people have been looking for and hopefully is something that people will relate to. I don't think at the end of the day Murdoch is going to close off his site. Although if I was sitting in his shoes, if at least in the old days, Microsoft might have paid $100 million to close off his site and give it only to Microsoft, and that might have been something we may have played with in those days. It's all a question of dollars and cents. I mean, it takes a certain amount of money to run a significant news organization that relies upon original content. So I think the New York Times' approach that they've announced this week of allowing the casual user to read 20 pages a month, and those heavy users, I have a lot of friends who have stopped getting the paper version and say, well, I read the New York Times every day online. Why do I need to get the paper version? But those people ought to step up and pay for those journalists and for those organizations that are sending people around the world. You know, it's a value to...
You really think people will do that? Won't they just go to another website that's open and free?
I think a percentage will go to open and free, but a significant percentage of the heavy users will pay for it. I think we're seeing models where people are starting to pay for content even though they don't really think they're paying for content.
Like?
So people are paying for iPhone apps. You may pay $6 for the CNN iPhone app. You think you're paying for that, but part of it is really to write the content. You know, it reminds me of in the early days of CNN, I sat down with Tom Johnson, who was the chairman of the board of CNN at the time. And he's the former publisher of the LA Times and the Dallas Morning News. And he said to us, and he was fairly prescient, he said that in the newspaper business, if you give it away for free, it's very hard to go back and charge. And he says, I'm afraid if you give this away free now, we'll never be able to get that other revenue stream. And that's a question you're asking. But I think we have to have that other revenue stream. You know, just relying upon bloggers to print rumors or to print summaries of what other people are saying in their analysis only goes so far. What we ultimately need is to have that bureau in Baghdad. We need to have 10 people on the ground in Haiti. And if we don't have that, then we'll suffer as a society.
maybe there'll be a few of those, but instead of having like 40 cameras on the runway in Haiti, there'll be 3 camera crews that will syndicate their content, like they did in a war zone, where they pull the news and it gets distributed.
That's already happening. I think, the U.S. model of having local newspapers with their own movie critic and their own Washington bureau probably was an anachronistic model in a world where content's available for everyone. But having editors and having good people on the ground in those places is important.
But the strange thing that you are seeing now is, for example, TechCrunch is now being quoted and being reprinted in the Washington Post. The
Right.
Post uses TechCrunch as a source, which is a blog made by independent bloggers. Not even sure if they call themselves journalists, really.
Well, I think 10 years ago, you and I used to joke around about what was a blog.
Yeah.
And that blog was this new creation, people would argue. And I think at that time, those of us who are in the news business said, well, look, the blog is really not something that's so new. It's basically a less edited, maybe slightly quicker put up to the world piece of journalism. So then the question is, how good is the journalism? And I think what we're seeing with some of those sources, like TechCrunch, that the mainstream journalists think that the quality is good enough that they're going to pick and choose some of that content.
Usually, actually, if you really want to know what the news is and get the analysis, you get it more from the specialized blogs than from the mainstream media. That's what I think, at least. I don't see CNN writing anything more sensible about Apple's new iPad than what TechCrunch and Mashable.
Well, look, in the old days, you might have gone to PC World or some specialized magazine. So I think that the people who are writing more specialized analysis online may give you better tech. But if you wanted the news from Baghdad, my guess is you're going to rely upon the New York Times Bureau before you rely upon Matt Drudge. One of the other things that's happening in media, which relates to all of this, and maybe more in the news side than in the corporate or commercial side, is that we're becoming very atomized as peoples, especially in this country where I think the general mainstream media used to tend toward the middle. Now with all these different outlets on cable television or online, if you're a conservative, you can watch the conservative television on Fox News, you can read the conservative blogs. If you're a liberal, you can watch MSNBC or read the liberal blogs and the Huffington Post.
Yeah.
And you never have to get really the other side's opinion, and you never get serendipitously analysis that says, well, there's certain good things in this healthcare bill and there's certain bad things. You just get one side or the other. And I think it's an unhealthy thing for our society.
Okay, I get that. But in the past, was it any different? The New York Times was always left-wing, liberal, and then Wall Street Journal was conservative.
I think it has changed, at least in this country when there was 2 or 3 television networks.
Yeah.
And you watch the nightly news, and granted, there's always a bit of bias in any newscast, but they sort of tended toward the middle.
Yeah,
And
they tried to be independent.
They tried to give both perspectives. Today, I don't know that Fox or MSNBC is really even trying to give you the middle.
And MSNBC seems to have aimed for the left, because that's where the gap is, and Fox has aimed for the extreme right.
And here we have a society where CNN is the one who's really trying to play the middle, and no one's watching. So it's it's somewhat of a condemnation on perhaps the viewer that it's more entertaining to watch people screaming at each other and opining than really to hear. But I think it's filtering down into American society, and I don't think it's a healthy thing.
That everything is becoming more polarized.
Everything's polarized. There's never a time when we sort of say, well, I can see your point, let's see if we can meet somewhere in the middle. It's you're crazy, no, I'm right, that kind of thing. I think there's a certain assumption when we go to professionals is that they're going to provide us with the best of their profession. So it's not, hopefully, if you go to a lawyer, the lawyer says, I'm going to try to do what's best for Michiel, not what's best for my pocketbook. So I would say that when I go to a journalist, I want the journalist to try to remove themselves to as much as they can from their perspective and try to present the news the best way and the widest way they can. I think in the news business, whether you pick to cover international news or healthcare is different than when I cover healthcare, I'm going to slant the story in such a way that manipulates the way my viewer understands the story. If you hear about how the New Yorker writes a story, it goes through 100 edits. and all kinds of fact checking. When I read the blogs about Tennessee football, and people are posting every kind of rumor, there's no quality control. And I think that there's a difference. And for certain types of news, I think we need that kind of quality and that kind of information.
Still, you go to those blogs and follow everything about Tennessee football. Although you were obviously not a great player.
Yeah. This will be our year.
Maybe the blogs are giving people what they want, which are more discussion points, talking points, something that gets their minds thinking or gets their mind off work. I don't know.
You know, an interesting question, which is far beyond my pay grade, is we live in a society, it seems to me, that prizes more and more speed. How quickly to get the information. So, you know, old media or a blog or a CNN TV is now out of date. You got to get it instantly from the person tweeting on the airplane.
Yeah.
That plane crashed in the Hudson, and everybody was, you know, so impressed that the first reports came from the tweeting. All right, you know, for a commercial story where people are going to trade on that information, that's important. And I got to admit, when we were at CNN, if we got the Clinton impeachment records up before the competition,
Yeah, that's important.
but how important is it? And that's the really more important
Commercially,
question.
it's important. Commercially,
To
you
a
gotta
certain
be
extent, but I don't know how many people are sitting home and say, boy, those guys from CNN got the story up a minute before the other guys did. What really probably in the long run is more important just as citizens is, do we get the information accurately? So yeah, I go to the Tennessee football websites and listen to every rumor that people are posting about something that's going to happen 3 weeks from now. I could pick up that same information 3 weeks from now, and it really wouldn't change my life a whole heck of a lot. So I think that we still have to sort of grow into all this new technology and figure out how that's going to affect our life. I think most people, you know, a parallel is email dominates everybody's life now.
Not for younger people. It's Facebook,
If not,
and
well,
Messenger.
but that kind of information, and I'm saying especially in the workplace, that everyone spends all their time responding to email and complains that they never have a chance to get their real work done.
Yeah.
So I don't know that we've really figured out how to cope with the instantaneousness of communication and information, and that's something that we're going to have to figure out as people, not necessarily as business. I would like to think it was making us wiser, smarter, better citizens. I don't really think it has, and in fact, I think this simplification of news and the ability to, you know, read it quickly on your phone or get a tweet or a Twitter feed, I'm not sure it's making us more informed. It's just
You get the bad news quicker.
right, exactly.
You get whatever unfiltered news faster.
right.
Or you're an old, cynical man.
Well, I think technology has to change, or businesses have to change to the technology, but I think citizens have to change to the technology as well. All my friends who drop their newspaper subscriptions and read the New York Times online in lieu of the newspaper, not the casual reader, but the serious reader, are going to have to adjust, and they're going to either have to start paying for that information, or they're going to have to start getting less informed.
But I think the truth of it is, there are only 2 or 3 newspapers like that per country that have real analysis and real good writers. And the rest are kind of crappy, as far as I'm concerned.
We don't need, 25 car manufacturers, and we may not need 25 newspapers. What we do need, and this is something that's puzzled me about the newspaper industry for a long time, is there are certain local stories that are relevant. So I don't know why the Knoxville, Tennessee, my hometown, I grew up there was 2 newspapers there. But do you really need a different
View on the robbery down on Main Street.
Well, you might need the local news competition, but you didn't need the Knoxville paper having a Washington correspondent and a London correspondent and a movie critic. And I think what we will perhaps get is local editions of national newspapers where you get the local sports and the local news and the local social information, and the rest will be national news. And in fact, that's what the New York Times has just started to do a bit of in San Francisco. San Francisco seems to be the New York Times' largest market outside of New York. And they now have I don't know if it's every day, but the Bay Area pages. It's 2 to 3 pages a day in the paper. And free media, you know, a lot of people forget that television, over-the-air television, has been a free advertising-supported model for a long time. So, you know, it's great that people write these books about freemium and, you know, but that model has been around.
However, you did something completely different. You stayed out of new media and you started a publishing company. What were you thinking?
Big mistake.
Who doesn't make those?
Our company is a multimedia platform, but the great majority of our revenues are from books.
So talk about your company. What do you guys do? Hundreds of heads.
Hundreds of Heads Media. We are Web 2.0 generally in books. We go out and we interview hundreds of people. We take their best pieces of advice about whatever we're writing about, and we ask them a story of how they got to that advice. And the books are a compilation of about 1,000 pieces of advice organized by topic. So our best-selling book is How to Survive Your Freshman Year.
In college.
In college, or How to Survive Life After College, or How to Survive Retirement.
Hundreds of people.
Hundreds
you
of
take
people.
the best piece of advice and make a book out of it.
And
Cheap. What do you pay the writers?
It's not a very cheap way to produce a book, and I wish I'd known that before we started. But our content,
sounds cheap.
Our content is syndicated over other old media and newspapers.
You syndicate your content out. Well, the publishing form is a book first, right, and a website.
We have books, website, and people take McClatchy Tribune, which is a syndicator, takes a certain number of stories each week and turns that into a newspaper article that's syndicated across newspapers across the country.
And then advice about these topics that the books were about.
Exactly. Now, if I was a new media executive right now, I would buy hundreds of heads and use the social networks to populate that information. So if any of your users are watching, it's a great opportunity for somebody.
Why don't you use Facebook more and those kind of platforms to distribute the content or get content in?
You know, I'm just an old media guy. I don't know how those new medias work.
Well, I guess because, again, we're struggling always. Like the costs are clear, but how are you going to make money on it? That's the big problem with it.
Well, what I do think is interesting about what we're doing, and where I think a lot of the social networks need to go, is we break our content into areas that advertisers are interested in. So an advertiser wants to reach a freshman in college who needs a credit card, who needs moving services. Yeah. They want to reach someone who's getting married, who has all the needs of a newlywed. So taking the funnel of people from social networks and running them through content areas, I think makes a lot of sense.
That may be the business model for the next century.
Maybe it's my next business model.
Thanks.
Thanks, Michiel.
So Mark, you were vice president of CNN and the first, I think, vice president of CNN.com.
General manager of CNN.com.
Okay, so you were general manager of
Senior vice president of CNN. You might want to start that again.